Rain fell over the small town of Millbrook on the afternoon Clara Bennett was supposed to become a bride. She stood outside the old stone chapel in a white dress that had cost her 3 months of savings, her hands trembling around a bouquet of lilac already wilting in the damp air. Inside, the pews were full of relatives who had traveled for hours, of friends who had brought gifts wrapped in silver paper, of a life she thought she understood. Then her phone buzzed with a message from the man she was supposed to marry. He wasn't coming. He had left the state that morning with someone else, someone who made him feel alive in a way Clara never had. There was no apology, only silence after that, as if 7 years together could be erased with one careless sentence. She didn't cry in front of anyone. She smiled through the whispers, thanked the guests for coming, and told them there had been a misunderstanding, that everything would be fine. But when the last car pulled away and the chapel doors were finally locked, Clara sat alone on the stone steps in the rain, her makeup running, her arms wrapped around her knees like a child who had lost her way home. The dress that once felt like a promise now felt like a costume for a life that no longer existed. That was where Daniel found her. He was the chapel's caretaker, a quiet man in his 40s who had buried his own wife 3 years earlier and had since filled his days with small, careful tasks, sweeping floors, fixing hinges, tending the garden behind the altar, anything that kept his hands busy and his mind still. He had watched the wedding preparations from a distance all week, never expecting to be part of the story. But he couldn't walk past a woman crying alone in the rain. Not after everything he had lost himself. He didn't say much at first. He simply sat down beside her, careful to leave space, and held an umbrella over her head instead of himself. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Then, gently, he asked the only question that seemed to matter. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Clara laughed, a broken, hollow sound, and shook her head. Her family had already left for the reception hall to cancel everything. Her apartment was leased under her fiancé's name. Her friends didn't know what to say to her yet. No, she admitted, she didn't have anywhere to go. Daniel nodded slowly as if he had expected that answer and said 4 words that would change the course of her life. "Now you do," he said, and helped her to her feet. He didn't take her anywhere strange or unfamiliar. He simply brought her to the small cottage behind the chapel where he lived, made her tea, and gave her his late wife's old sweater to replace the soaked wedding dress. He asked nothing of her. He expected nothing from her. He only offered a warm room, a locked door she could close if she wanted privacy, and the quiet reassurance that she wasn't required to explain herself to anyone that night. When she finally fell asleep on his worn couch, exhausted from crying, Daniel sat in the next room and looked at a photograph of his late wife, wondering if kindness could still matter in a world that had taken so much from them both. In the weeks that followed, Clara stayed in the cottage while she rebuilt what had been taken from her. Daniel never pushed, never hovered, never made her feel like a burden. He simply existed nearby, dependable in a way she had forgotten people could be. He taught her how to repair the chapel's old wooden pews, how to grow tomatoes in the small garden, how to sit in silence without it feeling empty. Slowly, the hollow place in her chest began to fill not with romance at first, but with something steadier, trust. Months passed before either of them acknowledged what was growing between them. It happened one evening as they repainted the chapel fence together, the sun setting behind the hills, when Clara finally asked him why he had stopped for her that day in the rain. Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. He told her that grief had taught him that people rarely need grand gestures. They need someone to notice they are struggling, and to stay. A year after the wedding that never happened, Clara stood in that same chapel again, this time in a simpler dress, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers instead of lilac. Daniel waited for her at the altar, his eyes glassy with emotion he no longer tried to hide. There were no hundreds of guests this time, only a handful of people who had watched her rebuild herself from nothing. As she walked toward him, Clara realized that the day she thought her life had ended in the rain was actually the day it truly began. Sometimes the person meant for us doesn't arrive with fanfare or perfect timing. Sometimes they arrive quietly, holding an umbrella, asking the only question that matters when everything else has fallen apart. Do you have anywhere to go? And when the answer is no, love, real love, simply says, now you do.